I absolutely love reading through the book of Ruth, and we're actually at the last chapter already, Ruth chapter 4, and just a quick overview. Usually with these Bible studies, I'll do the entire book, each chapter, one video at a time, and then I'll do an overview. But since this one was so quick, it only took us a month to get through because it's only 4 chapters, I figured I'd do it all now in this one video. So in chapter 1, we start out with a man from Judah with his family, and they leave where God basically wanted them to go to be, and they go to a place that did not know God. They went to Moab because of a famine. And I remember when reading through Ruth 1, one thing that struck me is sometimes we get into situations where we're desperate for some sort of resolution, and sometimes we may not make the best decisions in those cases. And this man, he ended up dying, and his sons die, and Naomi, she was left with her daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah. Orpah left, and then Ruth stayed. And Ruth's decision to stay with Naomi was significant because Moab was a pagan. They just followed, those people followed a lot of pagan rituals and ideas. Not grow up knowing the God of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so she made a huge decision to turn away from what she knew and, was raised in, and turn toward God. And we see from Naomi and Ruth and their story, and Ruth's character, and how she's so dedicated to Naomi, how Ruth is blessed by this. And she gleans in a field belonging to their nearest kinsman redeemer, a relative of Naomi. And he notices Ruth, and he gives her an opportunity to work in the field, and he gives them plenty of food. So they're physically blessed, even, by Ruth's decision to follow God. And Ruth had to go out there and do this. So it wasn't like she prayed and, she had faith in God, but she had no action. She took action. She went out to glean in the fields, and she just sat idly by. She wouldn't have had this huge blessing in her life, where in Ruth 3 we learn that Naomi suggests that Boaz should be a spouse for Ruth, and Ruth again took action. She's a very action driven person. First she leaves everything that she knows and she follows Naomi. Then when Ruth and Naomi arrive back in Bethlehem, even though Ruth is not from there, she takes action. She goes out in the fields to glean, to try to get something for them to eat, even though it was risky, as a Moabite to do that at that time. And now we see here in Ruth 3 that she's taking action again, for, presenting herself to Boaz. And Boaz had very wisely, and nobly, was able to marry Ruth. And so we read in verses 1 and 2, when we move on to Ruth 4, that Boaz, he went into the town with the guardian redeemer that he had mentioned to Ruth back in chapter 3. So in verses 3 through 5, we learn that Boaz, he offers Naomi's late husband's land along with Ruth the Moabite. And if you read it, then you'll see that first he offers the land, and the nearest kinsman redeemer says, yes, I will take the land. And then he said, okay, well, with the land becomes this widow who has no children, and the man is just like, actually, on second thought, he's like, this won't be good for me in my household. And the enduring word explained that this man probably had a wife and children and everything with their inheritance outlined already, and he didn't want to mess that up, most likely. So he declined in verse 6. And then in verse 7, we read, it actually says it in verse 7 that it was tradition to exchange sandals in order to legalize transactions in Israel. Boaz announces his ownership of property, his new ownership of property, since the man declined, and he's the next kinsman redeemer in line. And he also announces taking Ruth as a wife. I accidentally wrote Naomi at first, and then I crossed it out. So then he announces ownership of the property and taking Naomi as his wife. It's a public announcement. And then in verses 11 and 12, the elders bless Boaz and Ruth. And the beautiful thing about this story is that Ruth and Boaz have a son, verse 13. But in verses 14 through 16, you read about the women just supporting Naomi and loving on her and saying, she's lost everything, but now she's gained a son again, and Naomi is taking care of this baby. I really loved reading that because Naomi seems so blessed by Ruth and Boaz's son. And the child was named Obed, the father of Jesse, the father of David, which in the lineage of Jesus, which is incredible. And, you know, when I was talking about Ruth making those really big decisions, just taking charge, she took charge and made some really big decisions, and she ended up in the lineage of Jesus. You know, remember, she was raised in a culture that didn't even acknowledge God, and she is in the same lineage of Jesus. That's just incredible, truly incredible that our God, he uses anyone who has a heart towards him. I just think that's so cool. And then in verses 18 through 22, we read about the genealogy of Perez to David, and Perez was Jacob's grandson. So we read about that genealogy from him to David. And I just love the book of Ruth. If you need encouragement, if you feel like you're in a dire situation, allow God to lead you. Look at the life of Ruth and how God led her through some really hard things. I mean, she'd lost her husband, but also her brother-in-laws, her father-in-law. She left her whole family. You know, they were really poor. I mean, she had really gone through a lot to get from, you know, where she was as a married woman to widow, to, you know, in poverty, and then marrying Boaz, and then eventually, you know, giving birth to Obed, who would, you know, eventually have Jesse and David and be in the lineage of Jesus. So I just think this is such a great story. It's very hopeful. But as always, please let me know what you learned. I'm so excited to move on to the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. I love those books of the Bible. And I post a new Bible study video on Wednesdays and Fridays at 7 a.m. Eastern. And I can't wait to study the Bible with you again. Bye.